Hey guys, so we're doing the end of World War II, the legacy of World War II. Just to remind you, the legacy of anything is what it leaves behind, what you still have to live with after whatever it is over. So we're still living with some of the legacy of World War II, and some of it we're not. This one's called The Good, the Bad, and the Truly Ugly. So World War II was absolutely massive. You could spend a couple of years doing a course on World War II to really understand what was going on. There's so much to it. So we did a pretty much of a superficial look at World War II. So anyway, let's look at the good, the bad, and the truly ugly of what happened at the end of World War II. 1945 is a big year in the history of the world and the history of the United States. There's a bit of a shift in the United States from really keeping apart from world affairs to taking a very active role in world affairs. After World War II, the United States was one of the biggest players in the world, and it still is. 1945, in April, Franklin Delano Roosevelt died in office. He was in his fourth term, which was unprecedented. It had never happened before. He had a brain hemorrhage about, let's see, he was elected in 44, so about a year after being in office. Now, he's the only president in American history ever to serve 3 terms, and he's the only president in American history to get elected 4 times and to serve part of a fourth term. Every other president has served two terms of 4 years. So, when he died of cerebral hemorrhage, Harry Truman, that's the guy on the right, took over. And nobody was really giving this guy much thought. He was the vice president, but nobody really thought of what would happen if he had to be president. And they should have been thinking about it because FDR's health was not doing well. He was an untested quantity, and people didn't have big hopes for him. He did a pretty good job, in my opinion, given the circumstances and the lack of experience he had. He was the guy that decided to drop the atomic bomb on Japan because FDR was not around to make that decision. So in May, Germany surrendered. Hitler shoots himself in Berlin, and Victory in Europe Day is celebrated. In August of 1945, Harry Truman decided to drop bombs on Japan, basically because he did not want to invade a country that had refused to surrender. The country whose soldiers would prefer to commit suicide than surrender. The government who, even after the second bomb, hesitated uh, before surrendering to the United States and the Allies. So, you know, um, he had a choice. Do we invade Japan and these guys are just not going to give up, or do we drop the bomb and then tell them to surrender? And people are still debating whether that was the right decision. That's what we did last week, was debate that same decision. In September, Japan finally surrendered, and it was called VJ Day, Victory in Japan Day. All right, so we've got Victory in Europe and Victory in Japan Day. Here's a picture of Victory in Europe Day. This is a photo that used to be very popular, but since the Me Too movement has um, become a prominent part of our culture, it's very frowned upon what happened. And the story behind this, it's not a celebration of a couple just enjoying the moment. This sailor actually, he was on furlough in New York, which means he was not on active duty. He was back home. He heard the news and he just grabbed a woman off the street and kissed her. And these are the reactions of the people on the street. Different time. It's all 80 years ago. And it would not, this kind of behaviour would not be tolerated today, but at that time it was considered acceptable and even something to be appreciated by the American population. So it's looking pretty bad. World War One killed 15 million people. 15. World War Two killed 50 million people, and countless millions were wounded, scarred, psychologically damaged, homeless, etc. And this is a count of those dead. And this was a war that, more than any other war, had been targeted at civilians just as much as at soldiers. Bombings of cities by the Allies, by the Axis. But truth be told, the Allies killed many more people from bombings than the Axis did during World War II. So there are 7 million Germans dead, including civilians. There are 3 million Japanese. And that's including the civilians that died in the the atomic bombings. 500,000 Italians. Mussolini was shot by his own people and then hung upside down from a lamppost in Rome as just to show what they thought of him. It was a real insult, apparently, to have him upside down from a lamppost. The Allies, only 440,000 British died, which is a huge number, but it's not that much when you look at how many Germans died. 25 million Russians, Soviet Union soldiers, Soviets, Russians died in World War II. So, if you add up all the deaths in World War II, half of them were Russians. That's an incredible loss of life. Although, these numbers, they don't seem to hit as hard as they might. And even though it's a huge number, Winston Churchill, I think, said that 1,000,000 dead is a statistic. One death is a tragedy, something like that. And it's true. You look at the life of one person, being lost, and talking to the family of that person. It's completely tragic. 25 million. It's just a number, isn't it? But a terrible number. 6 million Jews were slaughtered during the Holocaust by the Nazis. And you look at all of those deaths, and then you look at the British and the American losses during World War II. It doesn't seem that much. I think it was something like 10 million Chinese also lost their lives, which is less talked about. And I guess I didn't put it on my list. It just occurred to me. Yeah. But only 420,000 Americans. It's striking how few Americans died in World War II. So what's the state of the world after World War II? Well, there are 21 million refugees. A lot of those are European, Polish, Czechoslovakian, all these Italian, German, all those lands where the fighting was, in Europe. Also in China, in Asia, in Japan, and around the Pacific. What does Europe look like? Well, Germany is destroyed, completely destroyed by Allied bombing, which devastated German cities, Berlin especially. Many Japanese cities are in ruins, especially as we know from the atomic bomb, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Much of Italy is also in ruins. Right, these are the defeated powers. The Allies, how are they doing? Well, Britain, a lot of British cities suffered from terrible bombing attacks, but not as much as Germany and Italy. Britain is bankrupt. It's borrowed so much money from America. They've got no money. They don't, and they are going to hurt for the next 15 years at least. My mum actually remembers that there was still rationing in the 1950s in Britain because there was no food to be had. That was like 6, 7 years after the war had ended. The Soviet Union lost millions of people, but by 1945 they'd actually made some gains. They'd lost all those people, but they'd occupied half of Europe, and they were not planning to leave. We'll have a look at the map in a moment. The US, again, they didn't lose that many people. There were no battles fought in the US. The economy was still booming after the war. They were doing great, and they were in a good position to start making the rules about what the world would look like after the war. So if we take a look at the map, the key is red is communist. Now the Soviet Union, as you will remember, this is Stalingrad. The Soviet Union, no, actually Stalingrad's more over here. They pushed back the German forces steadily, slowly, throwing bodies at the German army for months, for years, to push towards this target, Berlin, the capital of Germany. As they pushed the Germans back, which took basically 2.5 years, and that's when they lost all those millions of people, they took over the countries that had formerly been controlled by Germany. So the Soviet Union was making a land grab even as it was winning the war as an ally, and Stalin was thinking of the long game, thinking to what would happen after the war. And if he'd gotten further, he would have taken more. There's no doubt about it. So he was after resources, and he got them. So all this red stuff stayed communist after the war. The idea was that they would get to choose their own governments, and this was an exception. Yugoslavia, they actually did choose their own government. Well, kind of. It was a dictator like Stalin, but it wasn't. They weren't under the control of the Soviet Union like every other one of these countries after the war. And you'll notice it says click here to explore the Cold War. Now, I told you there'd be a war beginning straight after World War II. It became known as the Cold War. And it was because Stalin had taken all this territory, and the Allies, including the United States over here, and Britain and France, they were getting kind of nervous, and these nations too, getting kind of nervous about Stalin's goals, long-term goals, which didn't seem to be very friendly towards Europe. So the green stuff is non-communist. The Allies landed in Normandy and pushed towards Berlin, right? And they met the Germans pretty much, I think they met right here, or was it right here? Somewhere right around here. And the Soviets were coming from this direction, the Allies were coming from this direction. They shook hands, and then they had to figure out what was going to happen next. And we're going to be getting into that, and in particular this area here, because you'll notice Berlin's in what becomes known as East Germany, and then there's this place called West Germany. And East Germany is communist, West Germany is non-communist. So, next slide. We've got some problems to fix. Punish, protect, restore. You're going to punish the guilty. Thousands of Nazis were put on trial for war crimes in Germany. They were called the Nuremberg trials, and only 12 people were actually executed for war crimes, but thousands were jailed. These are the top, well, some of the top people in Germany, in Nazi Germany, Hermann Goering. Well, a lot of them killed themselves before they were able to be caught. Hermann Goering, who was in charge of the SS, which was the secret police in Nazi Germany, he was a nasty piece of work, that guy. He actually took a cyanide pill before he could be executed, but he would have been executed with the others. Alright, so we've made an example of the evil Nazis, and what's going to happen next? Well, you're going to protect the world with a better League of Nations. You remember that the League of Nations never had the US in it, which was an international body with representatives from all over the world to fix problems, disputes between nations. This time, it's the American commitment to world peace and to this United Nations body is going to be supported by America, and they're going to have it in New York City, where it still is, and it's still going, to show that the Americans are on board with it this time. So the restore part is a new country is created by the United Nations. It's called Israel, and it's a country in the world right now. This is Israel, this kind of pale bit, and this bit, the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights. These are disputed territories. They're still arguing over who owns what. How was the nation of Israel created? Well, it was the biblical homeland of the Jews. If you read the Bible, this is where the Bible happens, here and in Egypt. The discovery of the Holocaust, millions of starving Jewish people who had been tortured, slaughtered, starved, made slaves by the Germans. When they discovered that, they were so horrified. They said, we've got to do something for the Jewish people. 6 million people died. And there was pressure, especially in the United States, to create a homeland for the Jewish people. And the United Nations came up with the idea, under United States leadership, that why don't you just take part of Palestine and make it into where a lot of Jewish people were already living, and Arabs, Palestinian Arabs, were also living, and make that the Jewish homeland. So many Palestinian Arabs were kind of kicked off of their land to make way for Israel. They got very angry, and with the help of some other Arab nations, they actually attacked Israel straight after the creation of the State of Israel, but they lost the war. And this conflict did not end with that loss of the war. It's still actually going. And this guy is Jared Kushner. He's Donald Trump's son-in-law. He's a real estate developer from New York City and Jersey, mostly Jersey. His dad is a real estate developer too. Anyway, Jared Kushner is now in charge of solving the Arab-Israeli conflict, which has been going on since 1948. So I, for one, am pretty hopeful that that's going to be solved in his capable hands. All right, so tomorrow I'm going to give you a little check for understanding, a quiz, which is just for your pleasure to see how you do on. It's not going to be scored in my book, but just to see what you remember. So your job is to take the notes for this slideshow, which is on Classroom, and make sure you write them down, because we're going to be moving on to what is known as the Cold War after tomorrow. So quiz time in your feed tomorrow.